we've seen that there are differences in the capital markets, and how those capital markets affect internal governance. So why don't we now have a look at how that actually plays out? What are some of the differences that we see in terms of governance within companies, within these different regimes? One of the first areas where we see these differences is in terms of board structures. So we can compare a typical Anglo or agency perspective with a pluralist or relationship model, which is often based on countries like Germany or Japan and Korea. And we see that they actually structure their boards quite differently when you compare them with the US, UK or Australian style structure. So here we have three typical board structures that Tricker has actually set out for us, a representation. Can you guess which country that they're meant to represent in a stylised fashion? The first one here is a typical Australian model. And you can tell that because we have a separate CEO chair, and we have a lot of outsiders. And that's very typical of the Australian. This model here is far more like a US model. We have duality in terms of the chair CEO, which is quite common, and we also have a couple of inside directors. Still a majority of outsiders, but quite a different structure. In fact, the UK would have a structure that's somewhere in between. They would tend to have, a UK company would tend to have an outside chair like in Australia, but we would have this circle here would cover a few more insiders and maybe a couple less outsiders. And this structure over here on the right, well, that's typically, that's a standard kind of German structure where we have a two-tier board, the supervisory board, and also the management board. We can see the CEO is separate from the chair. We also have employee reps as well as shareholder reps on the board. So these are quite different structures, reflecting differences in culture and capital markets and even legal systems. Again, one of Porter's key points was that part of these changes, or a lot of these changes, are driven by the institutional nature of the capital markets and the governance system. So this is some old data, but again, we do have some updated data in the lecture. It's still not the most current, but I struggle a bit to find more current data. But these proportions tend to be reasonably stable. And what we can see are different patterns of shareholding. So let's look at this, that in different countries, what we see is the household, so a diversified shareholding. Look at the US, 49%, compared to less than half that, or a third in terms of Germany. Interestingly, in Australia, we only have 20%. So again, about half the US, still more than Germany or Japan, but about half what the US figure actually is. Where we start to see differences again in Germany and Japan, look at these numbers through here. This is companies, so this is non-financial enterprises. This is companies owning a share in each other. Notice nothing in the US, and again, a low proportion in Australia in an Anglo system. So what we have here are networks of companies who own shares in each other. And again, in Australia, okay, we have a high proportion of financial sector ownership, but really nothing being held in the banks, right? It's all in insurance companies, pension funds, super. Okay, so that would have got increased greatly over the last few years, probably. But what we can see is if we look at these banks, the debt holders don't own a lot of equity. Compare that to Germany and Japan, 3 to 5 times what we have. And in the US, again, double, 1.5 to double the US ownership. So these are quite different patterns of share ownership, even though we still have markets and listed organisations. There are a lot of forces, pushing towards convergence, but there's also a lot holding it back. And I think on balance, while we do see convergence in a lot of prescription, there are distinctive differences that we see across international systems of governance, and I think they'll be maintained for quite some time. But international isn't the only difference or the only contingency factor in terms of corporate governance of an organisation. Let's have a look at some other factors that affect the governance within an organisation. So again, we probably could sit here for hours talking about these differences, but in essence, we govern differently according to our life cycle, industry, strategy, ownership structure. We've covered off a fair bit with the international system, what our purpose or mission is, and even the type of company. A not-for-profit often has a reasonably different kind of governance structure compared to a listed entity. For instance, we have whole systems of continuous disclosure that we obviously don't need in a not-for-profit situation. Lifecycle, again, you might remember from lecture 2, we talked about the development of the role of the board, but that development occurs over time. Early on, a board can play a far more advising role, while there's still tightly held shareholdership by the founders or founders and family. And then as the board gets larger, it actually turns into more of a networking access to resources and then a monitoring role. Of course, all through that, it needs to be a cross strategy, but the emphasis changes as the company changes in terms of life cycle. Certain industries require large capital bases. And if there's large capital bases, you're probably going to have a diversified share ownership, which then means, of course, that we emphasize monitoring more. So there's many contingency factors, and part of the art of governance is looking at your situation and designing the governance in a way that will be specifically productive for your organisation in your contingency. And so that's what these various slides go to. Here are just some points to think about. How is governance different when you have an idea, a startup, when you're in growth, maturity, decline? How about industry? How does capital intensity change? How does stability of the industry or competitiveness of the industry, how do they change how we might govern? Or indeed, how we're owned, dispersed versus a concentrated ownership, institutional investors, ethical investors. All of these will have effects on how we govern within any specific organisation. And we can see that it comes together here in a little bit of a model, thinking about the advice or counsel role, the access to resources role, and the control role. So again, our classic theories, agency, resource dependence, and stewardship theories. So 3 key theories, and thinking through the possible factors that will mean we emphasize this role more because of these contingencies. So the final few slides are just looking at some different models out there in the literature about how boards work. How do we govern effectively within an organisation? There's a lot of similarities in these models, and so that's what I'm going to try and point out rather than going into detail. What are the commonalities around the models about what makes a board effective? Here's one, a classic from Rand Charan. What we can really see at the beginning is that we have a goal, right? And a goal is to get competitive advantage or to be successful. But that's really an organisational goal that we're trying to get. In order to do that, what do we have to do? And here we have a set of roles. Okay, so he doesn't call them that, but here are the things that a board has to have in place. And he's emphasising certain things. A particular emphasis on the leadership structure and the CEO, which is what we'd imagine from a US-based model. How do we do that? Well, we have group dynamics. So we actually have the idea here that how we work together as a board is important from week 3. Information, architecture. Now, notice in this we're also talking about who the individuals are, that they have the knowledge, etc. Plus also that information flows, so almost like policy and process too, that we can get the information. And again, another process issue here, that we focus on the right things. So how we do it, we get the right process, people working together well to execute the role set in terms of the goal. And another famous model from Colin Carter, who was, I think he was a BCG consultant, Boston Consulting Group, and Jay Lorsch, a Harvard professor. How does a board work? How does a board work? Well, we've got context matters, right? So the situation a company's in matters, and it will change what we see as the role of the board. So again, central to the model is what we want the board to do, its role. Then we have these various factors. The structure of the board. By structure, they mean who's on it, independent, non-independent, tenure, knowledge base, and membership, that's more in the knowledge base. Then we have our processes, our agendas, our papers, all of those kinds of things, and of course, the dynamics. Only they call it culture and behaviour. So we see these central elements. If we want to be successful, we have to have the right role. We need the right people on the board, operating in the right way with the right processes, delivering this positive dynamic. And there's many other models out there, but they essentially touch on these things. We've got to understand what we want the board to be able to deliver. Then get the right people, design the right systems that allow for the right dynamics if we want effective governance. I really hope you've enjoyed the course. I really enjoyed taking it. I hope you've gotten something out of it, and hopefully you can come back and use these videos if they're of any use whenever you'd like. So good luck.